for me, I have a soft spot for the Freakonomics box, which take the part of economics that I think is most interesting to students and gets people the most excited, which is applying economics to offbeat questions in real, not necessarily important, but in like fundamentally sound ways, helps you understand everything about the world around you. And if there's one thing you can say about the Chicago School of Economics, it's about understanding everyday activities through the lens of economics. And that's always been what's attracted me to economics.
Do you have a favorite one or two?
I think they're all pretty fun. I mean, we have one on a good one on pirates, and how pirates intentionally were misleading the press, the media of their time, to think that they were cruel and heartless, when indeed they were actually pretty democratic and weren't so cruel all the time, and had a really interesting set of institutions. We have another box that is about Freakonomics box, which is about taking simple kinds of lab experiments that people do often in college students, and going to the far reaches of the world, into the indigenous peoples of the world, to see whether indeed there's one human way of approaching economic problems. And it turns out there isn't, that in different cultures people play these games completely differently, and it actually gives you a lot of insight into thinking about the extent to which there's first, what can you learn from a lab experiment, but number two, should you really think about, it informs how we think about the economic model, because we know in the real world people don't always behave the way the economic model says they do. Turns out in some cultures people really behave that way, in cultures that reward that kind of behavior, and then in some cultures people do crazy stuff that make no sense at all in terms of modern economic thinking. But I like it because it's at the end of the book, in the last chapter, and you've learned these models. And then we step back in our behavioral and experimental chapter, and we say, well, so let's think about how this applies, kind of the, how does it, what are the weaknesses? Where do things start to maybe fall apart a little bit? And I think that's, for a really good student who cares a lot about the material and is thinking hard, I think once you've learned the material, to then say, okay, what's not perfect about the material? I've always thought that's a great way to try to teach.
It sounds like it doesn't work when the incentives in a culture aren't economic.
It's more than that. It's that the economic incentives aren't always as you'd expect. So I'll give you an example. You play games where one person gives another person a gift. Okay, so this is called the ultimatum. Let me go back. So the ultimatum game is as follows. One is a giver and one's a receiver. The giver takes, and they play it with cans of tuna fish. So the giver is given, say, 5 cans of tuna fish, and can choose to give between 1 and 5 cans of tuna fish to the receiver. The receiver then can either accept the amount of tuna fish that they've been given by the giver, or they can say, no, I'd rather have everybody have 0. So the simple economic answer is, even if let's say there are 10 cans of tuna fish, and I give you 1 of my 10 cans, you're better off with 1 can than no can, so you should accept the fact that you get 1 and I get 9. Humans hate that. In Western cultures, if I keep 9 cans of tuna fish for myself and give you 1, you say forget it, nobody gets any tuna fish. Okay? But it turns out in one particular culture, this is in Mongolia, that when you have 10 cans of tuna fish, the giver almost always gives more than 5 away. So they give more than half to the other guy, and the other person routinely turns down and says everyone gets 0. And it makes no sense. Why would someone do that? Then you look at their culture, it turns out they live in a competitive gift-giving culture, where if I give you a gift today, you are morally obligated by the rules of society to give me back a better gift in the future. And so what you see is these people say, like, I don't want to, if I take all this tuna fish today, I got to give it back later with interest. I don't want to do that. Now what's funny is, in the experiment, there's no giving back. It's a one-shot game. And so what really ultimately you learned from this Freakonomics box is how it's on the limits of experimentation and how little you can learn from the lab, because people bring in their culture and their rules of thumb, and when they do that, it really, what people are playing a different game than the experimenter actually thinks they're playing, and it's a very sobering result for experimenters when they found it.
And in the same way the field has had a huge revolution in empirical work over the last 20, 30 years, we try to reflect that in the book, so it's not just theory. It's also going through, look, here's data that show where actual economists have proven that this theory does work, and here's how people are using it in real life. So I'd say that to me feels the most different between this book and the typical intermediate micro book.